be a really fascinating program. Oh, maybe to begin with, if you're familiar at all with Chicago, you know that its skyline is really defined by two iconic buildings, the Willis Tower, formerly the Sears Tower, and then also the John Hancock Tower. Both of those were built by the architect Bruce Graham. And what's fascinating, Graham, before he built those two, built two buildings in Kalamazoo, one of which you are now sitting in, and also what was then the Upjohn Company's headquarters. And this was known as Building 88. This building was really unusual in that, first of all, it was just a stunning, beautiful design, extremely, I guess, elegant would be the word for it. Its local nickname was the Taj Mahal, and it does bear comparison, I think. But it was an early example of the open office movement, where it really blurred the lines between sort of work and home, and brought into concepts of what sort of modern domesticity was about, as well as the new executive workplace. And unfortunately, this striking building was demolished in 2007. But to discuss its significance and its important concepts that went into its design and its environment, we're very pleased to have with us today Christine Hahn. Dr. Hahn is the professor of art and art history at Kalamazoo College, where she specializes in 20th century art and also new ways of looking history of the Modern Art Museum, and then architecture and urban identity, which focuses on design of interior and exterior environments as they reflect real and imagined futures. And I think with this in mind, it makes Dr. Hahn the perfect person to kind of really, in some ways, revisit, but also illuminate the importance of Building 88. So please welcome Dr. Christine Hahn.
Thanks so much, Greg. That was a lovely introduction. You really did your research, so it's nice to hear. It's so nice to be back here at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to test something out. If I am talking over here, can people still hear me? Yeah. Yes? Okay. So I'll try to emote, but let me know if at some point you can't hear me. So how many of you have seen this wonderful 1954 movie directed by Billy Wilder, Sabrina? A couple of you. This is one of my favorite films. Growing up, my mom and I would watch it together. And beyond Audrey Hepburn's, gorgeous dresses, there is a pivotal scene in this movie that really sort of epitomizes where office buildings were in the early to mid 1950s. So you'll see that Audrey Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart are viewing the skyline in Manhattan. Audrey has just returned from learning how to cook in Paris, and she has to sort of put together a quick souffle in Humphrey Bogart's executive suite. So you'll notice that they're in his office, which is way up in the clouds. You can see the skyline a little bit in the backdrop. You also can see the kitchen, and then here you see Audrey staring out at this magnificent Manhattan skyline. So up until about the 1950s, really sort of the epitome of the corporate headquarters was located in urban downtowns. They were very tall and narrow, primarily to allow for sunlight to penetrate the buildings as best as possible. And then there becomes a shift in the 1950s where all of a sudden technologies such as air conditioning, steel core structures are introduced, which allow for, on the one hand, much taller, higher office buildings, But on the other hand, you can lay those buildings flat, and all of a sudden you've got these long horizontal stretches of buildings. So in the 1950s and 60s, you start to see this move from corporate headquarters, from urban downtowns, and they spread out into rural areas. Now, it's interesting, oftentimes this is described as a suburban move. This is actually not the case. These are corporate headquarters that are moving to rural areas where all of the infrastructure is sort of built around these headquarters. So some of the examples of these are the General Life Insurance Company in Connecticut. This was completed in 1957 by Skidmore, Owings Merrill. And another one you might be familiar with is the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, Michigan. This was designed by Eero Saarinen. So what you have in the late part of the 1950s are CEOs, through a variety of different factors, wanting to move their corporate headquarters from downtown cores into rural areas. And that's exactly what's happening here in Kalamazoo in the early part of the 1950s. Now, Donald Gilmore, he was the CEO of Upjohn and really oversaw its immense growth over the 1950s and 60s. He already knew by 1945, basically 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he writes a letter, an interoffice memo, and says, I'm starting to think that in the future, we should move to the countryside and have a low-slung one-story building. The US government at this time was urging large-scale businesses that were important to the US economy to move out of city centers because they were worried that these were areas that could easily be taken out by a bomb. So there were a lot of tax incentives to move your headquarters into rural areas. The idea being that if you had a low-slung building that was out in the countryside, that even if parts of that facility were bombed, it wouldn't take out the entire manufacturing capabilities of those particular businesses. So this is Upjohn in downtown Kalamazoo in the 1940s. And this building is still extant today. It was designed by Albert Hahn in 1934. It's now part of the National Historic Register. And I believe Bronson is using this building. So you can still see this building in downtown Kalamazoo today. So despite the fact that Donald Gilmore was interested in building in 1945, it would take another 12 years before his ideas came to fruition. So in my research of Donald Gilmore, it's been fascinating to learn that he is one of the premier patrons of mid-century art and design. With just a few other contemporaries, he really valued design aesthetics. He believed in design as a universal communication tool. And as a result, he ended up bringing to Kalamazoo the top names in architecture, design, and photography. So pictured here is Will Burton. Donald Gilmore brings Will Burton to be his in-house communications director for Upjohn. He's bringing Will Burton from Fortune magazine, which is the highest circulation magazine in the 1950s. Will Burton is renowned for his design work. And these are some of the things that he helped design for the Upjohn company. You've got Scope magazine, which was an internal magazine for the company. And then he designed these exhibitions that would travel around to various medical conferences. Gilmore was really a pioneer in understanding how soft marketing was going to really showcase the products of the Upjohn company. So he had walk-in installations. He had a miniature exhibition at the Smithsonian. You might be familiar with his relationship with Walt Disney, where he had an exhibition of a little drugstore at Disneyland that you could visit. What's fascinating also is how he embraced technology. He was one of the first to use teleconferencing and conferences through television satellite. I mean, we're talking about, this is happening in the 1960s, so it's really unheard of. Gilmore was very much ahead of his time, and as a result, really brought some amazing artists, architects, and designers to Kalamazoo. He also, with his wife, sponsored the building that we are currently in. And I think this room is actually part of the original design for the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill designed it alongside the building that I'm going to be talking about. And it's interesting because when Gilmore was going through the list of architects that he was considering for Building 88, he dismissed Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was on the list but didn't make it. But this building was actually based on an earlier Mies van der Rohe design. That Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill was kind of the design arm and partner with Mies van der Rohe. And so they put that into place. But it's interesting to note, if you're walking around these galleries, one of Mies van der Rohe's ideas for the small regional museum was to have this idea of floating walls. So if you look carefully in there, you'll notice that there is black paint at the base of the walls and at the top to kind of create that sensation of floating. This is when you're in the lower level where the permanent collection is installed. That's a direct Mies van der Rohe idea. He never really got to play out his ideas for the small regional museum, but this is actually one of the only examples based on his designs. So this building in its own right is fascinating, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this today. So the lovely thing about Donald Gilmore is not only was he a pioneer in terms of aesthetics and modern design, but he was a meticulous recorder of the entire process of this. So imagine my delight and surprise when 6 years ago I was at the Jean Legacy Collections. I had a curiosity about Will Burton's work, and Lynn Houghton hands me these stacks of files from Upjohn that meticulously records Donald S. Gilmore's process in thinking about, selecting the architects, working with the interior designers. All of this is written down in interoffice memos, photographs. He has telephone transcripts that he then jots his private thoughts down next to. And it's just been wildly fun seeing how he's thinking about this building. I talked to his nephew, Don Parfit, about it. And, he said, everyone always called this building Don's Folly because Don was just so invested that every single detail was not going to be overlooked. And so we'll talk a little bit about just how carefully he looked into the details for this. So this is the site, which is out at the corner of Portage Road and Romance. Upjohn already had some manufacturing facilities out there, but you can see how in the 1950s, how very rural it was. It was really just a lot of empty fields. And this is Building 88, as it was completed and done with the landscape design by Sasaki and Associates, and then the design by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And as Greg mentioned, the lead architect on this was Bruce Graham. Now, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, they had an ethos where they didn't want to identify who the lead project designer was. It was supposed to be the Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill entity. But in recent years, more and more information is coming out. And we know, based on the records, of course, that Bruce Graham was the lead architect for that building. So Ezra Stoller, who is the preeminent photographer of modernist architecture, was commissioned by Gilmore to come out when the building was completed and photograph it. So the next series of images I'm going to show you are photographs that Ezra Stoller took. You'll notice as we look at these photographs that Stoller was really interested in just the aesthetic lines of this building. He's using his photographs to look at mirrored surfaces, translucent spaces, and the ways in which the interior and the exterior are going to reflect one another. And then just to go back, this is Bruce Graham. And later he would be building the Hancock Tower and the Sears Tower. But Bruce Graham was really very much viewed the Upjohn building as his pet project and puts a lot of his own influence into the building, which we'll talk about in just a second. Oh, you know what? Let me just go back here. For those of you who are architecture buffs, I just thought you'd enjoy hearing the list of architects who were considered and rejected. So Gilmore takes a team from Upjohn and they tour these buildings over a series of a couple of months. So the list was Yamasaki, who you'll know as the architect for the World Trade Center. I was just in Northfield, Minnesota, where he's done a number of buildings for Carleton College. Mies van der Rohe, the aforementioned Mies van der Rohe, and then Philip Johnson, who was a sort of preeminent postmodern architect who had trained under Mies van der Rohe. Didn't make the cut. My favorite part is that Saarinen and Breuer, who are two of the huge names in modern architecture, were put on the second tier list and cut. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the philosophy behind this design. This is a photograph of Building 88 at nighttime. You can see that it's all aglow. Again, this is a photograph by Ezra Stoller. And you'll notice those little triangular formations at the top. I think of this as a sort of white marble coffered lid that sits atop this very low slung curtain glass wall. And inside of this curtain glass wall, you have a series of 9 interlocking pavilions, each of which has a different group of plantings and water. Here are some examples of objects that are in the archives. I will thank Jeremy Winkworth at the end, but Jeremy Winkworth runs this wonderful website called Upjohn.net, where he collects all sorts of memorabilia, photographs, memos, and on here you can see some really fascinating information about the Upjohn building. So it was originally budgeted to cost about $15 million. It then, of course, takes much longer than anyone would anticipate and finishes at $17.4 million. And, you know, when you're thinking about, I don't know what the conversion would be today, but it was very expensive. One of my favorite lines is, so Gilmore absolutely believed in the finest materials. So stretches of gorgeous white marble. There was gold leaf at the base of some of the reflecting pools. And you'll notice that in the publicity materials, sort of tongue in cheek, the publicity manager says, if asked about the gold pools, do not mention there's actually gold in those pools. In fact, hopefully they just won't even notice that these pools are sort of glowing with gold. So it was very much rich, luxurious materials, but to be very understated about them in a very Midwest way. And Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill really saw themselves as a Midwest country. The director of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill once made the argument to the President of the United States that if they did a master plan of the United States, they should put all of the industry in the Midwest, and then people could just live on the East and West Coast because the Midwest was the engine of America. Okay, so horizontality and translucency. These are sort of the key design concepts that Gilmore was interested in expressing in this building. And for Gilmore, it wasn't just the aesthetics of horizontality and translucency, but for him, it really was a corporate philosophy. It was an ethos. And so he emphasizes this idea that there is a non-siloed, spontaneous type of interaction from every level of the business interacting with one another. So he really wanted these open, free-flowing spaces where you would maybe run into a colleague in the hallway, have a quick conversation, or maybe you are walking down the hallway and you run into somebody from a completely different division, and then there's a little bit of synergy there. These are all concepts that today, you know, Google, Apple, Netflix, when they built their headquarters, they were all very lauded for these concepts. But whenever I read that, I'm always like, well, you know what? We were doing this in the 1960s, so we were ahead of the game. And actually, there was a book published fairly recently about the open office movement, and they place the open office movement as emerging in the mid-1960s in England. And again, I had to correct them and say, actually, the open office movement really begins much earlier than that in the United States through these corporate headquarters that are starting to dot the countryside around the United States. So these are the floor plans for the building. You can see that the upper level there has those 9 interlocking pavilions. And the way that you would enter the building is through the lower level, and you'll see here. So you enter through the lower level, and then you've got these parking areas here. And this space right here was directly tied to the turning radius of a car. So the idea being that you would drive up, drop off your passengers, turn around, and then park there or elsewhere. So one of the things that I'm looking into in this project is the relationship and inspiration of domestic models leading up to the design of Building 88. I'm arguing in a sort of longer paper that D.S. Skidmore, along with Bruce Graham, were interested in trying to define a new sort of corporate identity that merges together the domestic space and the executive workspace. So 2 sort of iconic homes that were built, the Villa Savoy, this is in the suburbs of France, designed by Corbusier in 1928. And then the Farnsworth House, which is in Plano, Illinois. It was built in 1945, completed in 51. Both of these buildings have a fascinating history that if you're taking my architecture class, I would delve into. But one little tidbit I just want to share with you about the Mies van der Rohe is that it turned out later that I think he was having an affair with Edith Farnsworth, who was the woman who commissioned the home. And she ended up suing him. It was just like it was a really, there's a lot of upheaval. But one of the reasons that the house is on stilts like that is because the river that it's near would flood annually. So the water would just, flow underneath the building. But here you can see in the machine construction, the curtain glass wall, the use of white cladding, that there was inspiration from these 2 iconic buildings when Bruce Graham was thinking about the design for Building 88. Here are some of the renderings that were done. And these renderings I wanted to bring in specifically to sort of demonstrate how Graham and his team were thinking about the relationship between outside and inside space. So you can see already in the rendering of the executive offices that they're really thinking about these large glass walls and this exposure to the outdoors. There's some really funny material talking about sort of imagining that, you're working, you take a little break and you go take your golf irons and, hit them off into the fairways that lie behind the building, which you can kind of see there in that rendering in the bottom right corner. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing that spread of windows and planting. So you can see that from a very early stage, the architects were thinking about this relationship between inside and outside. Here are some additional photos by Ezra Stoller, but I'm gonna kind of go to this one because I just think it's so gaspingly beautiful. You can see that Stoller is capturing that reflective surface, these stones hidden underneath this pavilion. I bring in this example in particular because many of the critics who are reading this building in their writing found a Japanese influence in the design. And indeed, a Japanese city gifted, the sort of ancient Japanese stoneware to sit next to the building. There's a lot to suggest that there's a Japanese influence in this design. But interestingly, Bruce Graham was very annoyed by that comparison. He grew up in Colombia, and he insisted that the building was actually inspired by the Colombian design of courthouses. So I just bring this in to say that there's a sort of debate surrounding how you would read this particular space. Here's another just gorgeous photograph by Ezra Stoller of these pavilions. Of course, it's always with the heartache of realizing that this building no longer exists, of course. And here's another example here of those pavilions. This photograph I really like because it shows the layered sense of translucency that the architects were going for. So you've got a corner of a building, you've got that long hallway, and then you can see through the windows across and around to the other spaces in the building. So there's always the sense of layered light that you're experiencing as you're moving through a space. And here Sasaki and Associates talks about how they tried to mirror that grid-like formation in their plantings. And here's that corner with a closer look at that coffered edge. So the idea being that you are inside and protected, but have full exposure to the outside. It was also funny talking to Don Parfit about this, because especially corner offices like this, because like so much modern architecture, you know, the ideal is this sort of pure transcendent aesthetic of indoor-outdoor. And he said, but, you know, this was the early stages of HVAC. So you had condensation and dripping, and, you know, you could never really see out the windows because they were like all you know, when that condensation just kind of fogs up your windows. So it's the difference between the ideal and the lived reality. Another angle here. So leisure and learning, this is something that I found really, I found it really rewarding. So all these images that we looked at before, there are these beautiful aesthetic photographs by Ezra Stoller, but there's no people in them. There's no one actually using the building. But Donald Gilmore had a fascination and a specificity when it came to aesthetics, but he also was really interested in the humans who were going to be using and living and working in that space. And so, again, you know, there's all this talk about, oh, Google had a cafeteria and they had ping pong tables, and but Gilmore really wanted his employees to have moments of leisure. Back in the 1960s, and this will be shocking to hear, CEOs were routinely and regularly expected to take 3 months vacation a year, 3 months. And he would use those 3 months to travel to Rome. He had a ranch in California. But this was very much the ethos. There was this understanding that only through leisure and relaxation could creativity and innovation arise. He also instituted the first 35-hour work week in the United States, and offered community college classes in Building 88 so that you could get your bachelor's degree for free. And I recently had somebody tell me, which just, I just love this concept, that when you were hired in at Upjohn, no matter what your position was, you had to work for a full month as a janitor to understand the entire sort of system of Upjohn. So he really lived into this idea of the horizontality and non-siloed nature of the Upjohn company. These are some other examples. There's a lot of writing about the cafeteria. He believed in really good food. So they would serve prime rib, they would serve lobster, and they thought a lot about nutrition and making sure that the food that they served was nutritious. So there's a lot of articles and details about that. And then here you have this, this lounge for the cafeteria workers. Again, where they can, when you look at the schedule, they have time distinctly set after breakfast, between breakfast and lunch, and then between the lunch and dinner service. There were designated times where you were expected to relax, re-energize yourself in these really tranquil spaces. For those of you who are interested in gardening, they have a whole readout of all of the plantings that were there. There's some gorgeous Japanese maples, well, that once were there. And there was a little duck family that would hang out in the ponds. And so they would, you know, every year they would have the ducks come and visit. And I wanted to show these photographs of the building when they were in use. You can see they had a family of swans also that liked to come and use the protected ponds. And then cafeteria workers. These are all photographs that were collected by Aline and Wubo Major and are available on the upjohn.net website. So executive offices and domestic space. This is really where you get Gilmore going. So this is some of the most fun stuff to read. So the thing to know about the interiors is that Gilmore was very suspicious of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. This was at a time when architecture was very distinct from interior design, and typically in building design, you would have a separate interior designer. Sohm is a firm that wanted total control. So they had an in-house interior design firm run by, at that time, Jane Johnson. Well, Jane Johnson is the wife of Bruce Graham. And so Donald Gilmore, trying to be very careful of navigating that relationship, there's a lot of transcripts and memos of phone conversations where his close friend Hollis Baker, who runs Baker Furniture up in Grand Rapids and it is still running today, they would have these sort of offline communications about what they thought about what Jane was bringing in and did you like that design? And at one point, Donald Gilmore's like, he's like, you know, let's on the down low, like consult with some other interior designers because I'm just not convinced that Jane's doing a good enough job for us. And, you know, he gets into the weeds. If it's about the chair back height, the number of tufts on a chair, the legs, the way that the legs of a chair would meet the ground, how they would stack. He had input on every piece of this process. And his mind, he just remembered all of these details. In fact, sometimes I felt sorry for Jane because you could see that she was like really trying to meet his specifications, but he was just so exacting. And when the building was being installed, the furniture company who did the installation won an award because nothing was standardized in the building. So they had to design new dollies to bring all of the stuff in. So the installation company was rewarded for their hard efforts. This photograph in particular, so this is a gorgeous walnut surface executive boardroom table, and the ashtrays that Jane Johnson had picked out had a rough ceramic bottom to that. Well, Donald Gilmore was like, not on my watch. And so he designed his own ashtrays. You can see the example up there. They're gorgeous. They're just a really simple U of the Upjohn logo. And then there's a velvet bottom so that you could slide the ashtray across the tables. But this is an example of just how exacting he was as he thought through every element of this building. And there he is pictured at the front of that. On the left-hand side of the screen are photographs of what the offices in the downtown Kalamazoo spaces would have looked like in the 1930s. And then you can see the promotional materials on the right-hand side, really sort of embracing that open office concept. So they were very aware of introducing this new type of work environment into the space. Here's a close-up of that. These are executive offices, again, emphasizing that idea of translucency. So the windows open onto the hallway as well as onto the pavilion. And these chairs, you know, I read round and round, Jane just couldn't get the chairs right. And it's funny reading the names too, because she sent through like all of the iconic chairs, like he turned down the Barcelona chair by Mies van der Rohe. He turned down the Hans Wegner. These are all chairs that, you know, now are so ubiquitous in any type of office building. But for Gilmore, he was really interested in this idea of modern comfort. He was like, sure, these chairs look nice, but if you're going to have to be in there for an hour in a meeting, you know, what height is that going to put you at? Is your back going to be able to relax? Will the wheels scratch the floor? So he was really thinking about all of these details. So everything that you see in here down to the artwork was okayed by him. And then just a reference back to that Sabrina photograph that I showed you earlier. Here you can see the inner executive offices did come with a little kitchen suite. You've got the private bathrooms. And you can see that the interior is really decorated with this idea of merging together a sort of warm, homey space alongside a corporate space. Some other examples here. And so then I want to end with just how publicly recognized this building was. It was, so this is part of a multi-page spread in the Kalamazoo Gazette. But this building really attracted the attention of architecture critics from around the United States. And what's interesting is that Gilmore was, when designing this building, in the process of building Upjohn buildings in Mexico and Australia. And you can see the direct relationship between this design and the buildings that he was building in Mexico and Australia. So he really is creating a sort of global footprint for the Upjohn look. This is a spread in a design magazine here. You can see that they're using the Stoller photographs. This from interior design. They give a lot of attention to the Midwestern prairie and the ways that Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill reflect the prairie landscape with that low-slung horizontal design. And some publicity photographs there. And here. And so I'm going to end it on a sad note, which is, of course, that the building was destroyed in 2007. And it went down. So I moved here in August of 2007. I think it was demolished in July. And when I arrived on campus, I heard these stories of, word going around town that the building was coming down. And so people would rush out with their pickup trucks and collect all of these gorgeous materials that now, line garden beds and steps around Kalamazoo. And these are the letters that were pulled down from the building. I want to thank, as I mentioned before, Jeremy Winkworth, who has put so much effort into updating this really amazing website, upjohn.net. If you're curious about any of the photographs or things I've shown you, I highly encourage you to check out that website. That is a photograph of him from the early 80s, but he saved everything. I mean, he's got his employee letter, just tons and tons of documentation. It's a really wonderful site. I also want to thank the Zhang Legacy Collection Center, and specifically Lynn Houghton, who has worked on this project and helped me throughout the years. I initially started, my curiosity with the Upjohn family initially started because there was a 7-year exhibit sponsored by the US government that traveled the world, and it was called Kalamazoo and How It Grew. So Kalamazoo was selected as this representative all-American city and traveled around the world. And I was curious about this exhibition. And so that's sort of how I got interested in the Upjohns. And then I just realized that they had this fascinating history, a really fascinating, rich history in terms of art, exhibitions, and aesthetics, all things that I love. So I'm really thankful to Lynn and the entire staff there for, they would just pull things out and be like, hey, have you seen this? Or, hey, you should check this out. So that was so helpful. I'm so grateful. And to Miriam, who helped organize this talk, thank you so much. And some early curators, Vicki Wright, Missy Stempian, and Carly Niehaus, and Greg helped provide archival material as I was looking into the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts and its design. So thank you all so very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. So my next step is I'm currently revising an article. And if you have experience with Building 88, I would love to hear from you. That's my email address. Just shoot me an email and say, hey, I have some stories or I have some pictures. I would love to speak with you. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. It was just incredibly expensive to, oh, you know what, I promised I would repeat your question for the live stream into the microphone. So the question was, why did they demolish the building? So I think Pfizer purchased it, and apparently the utility costs of holding it were just too high, according to them. What's very interesting is that there's an art collection that has gone missing. So D.S. Skidmore, of course, kept meticulous records of all of the original art that went into this building. And somebody said to me, you know, we've never found that art collection. So another thing I've been curious about, Jeremy has a list of some of the artworks on the on his upjohn.net, but yeah, it's a very sad thing.
I worked for the company and was on the site lead staff during the merger. So first of all, the art collection, both downtown and 88, went to Pfizer's and to New York City, basically. I mean, they lost the company. They owned it. Secondly, the reason the building was torn down was for two reasons. And I heard this come out of the mouth of an executive in the manufacturing division that basically had the site at that point. And it was because of its beauty.
You're kidding.
No.
Wait, I just need to repeat that for the last stream.
It was because of its beauty and because of the fact that it was associated with the Upjohn company, which they were trying to eliminate.
So it was because of the beauty and because of the association with the Upjohn company. That's fascinating.
The beauty because it was a manufacturing organization, and they said, we don't house our executives in palaces.
We don't house our executives in
We house our
palaces.
executives with the workers in the manufacturing plant.
Ah.
So they spent a lot of money to renovate and create offices in Building 41 for those individuals. They didn't want them housed in Building 88.
Interesting. So they were housed in 41, not 88. Can you email me with your info so that we can talk a little bit later? Can I quote you on that?
My name is Mike Henderson.
I'm going to take notes on this.
No, it's not. I'm kidding. I gave my buddy a hard time because he said, be careful what you say.
Well, thanks for that comment. And if, you know, I can keep you anonymous if you do want to email me and just go on the record with that one. I saw another hand. Yeah.
Can I just point out one thing I was thinking about when I saw this lecture coming up and it points out the difference between what I call the private world, corporate world, private money, everything like that, and the public world.
Mm.
Two magnificent works of art were created in Kalamazoo that were architecturally beautiful. And the one in the public and the private world goes wherever that money travels, whereas this one remains because it's in the public realm of the city.
Yeah, that's a great insight. So that the public gift remains and the private one has just gone away. Yeah, absolutely.
I will be sending a long email. I
Yes.
worked in Building 88, had 3 different offices.
Oh, wonderful.
And it was an amazing building. But I'm here to tell you, I never spent a month as a janitor, so I don't know.
No! Dang, I really love that anecdote. Maybe they phased it out at some point.
It was
a long time ago, I think, but I don't think they ever made the executives do that.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Well, okay. I'll have to change my starry eyes on that one.
I do have a story about a janitor. And do you remember Harm Bowen? He was a wonderful guy, and he observed, you're talking about the different courtyards. J Court was the executive. That was on the front of the building, and that's when you would arrive. You were in J Court. And when, in those days, your secretary went with the senior executive if they got a promotion. And Harm observed one of the secretaries whose boss had just been elevated to J Court. He said, yep, she's walking that J Court walk. And we all knew what he meant.
I love it. Each court had its like own identity. That's great. Jody.
I never worked in Building 88, but I just confirmed with a former board member of mine who did.
Oh,
She had shared an anecdote that, she's about my stature, which means not a 6-foot man, and worked there and made a formal request to have the desk lowered so that she wasn't like this. So I guess everything was designed with
For a 6-foot
tall man in mind. And so your presentation just gave another layer beyond gender to, I guess it was many, many layers she had to go through to get, the legs shortened because they were appalled. They said, well, then we can never use the desk again. And
oh
she was
boy.
like, there's many ugly behind it. So anyway, just obviously they were very serious about how everything was designed.
I love that detail because, the pages devoted to the desk legs and the cafeteria chair legs, it's just fascinating.
They did chop the legs for her.
When I got to janitorial, I joined Upjohn in 1972 with a degree. But the man I shared the lab with had a high school diploma, and he started off 6 months as a janitor. And that is when he knew the apocalypse was happening, when they eliminated that. And the second thing he knew was happening was when they started charging for meals in the cafeteria.
Oh, interesting. So he saw the transition.
And that was in the early 70s.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, is when I came for the interview, on the way back to the airport, the taxi driver said, had I seen the Taj Mahal? And I said, no, I've strictly been downtown. He says, well, then you cannot leave without seeing it.
Oh.
So he took me out, we drove around, he stopped, got me an opportunity to see. And I think that was, you kept mentioning the ethos. That was my first indication of the ethos of this community.
Ah.
That the cab driver knew that.
Yeah. And was proud of the building.
Oh, yeah, I mean, this was something you cannot leave this community.
Oh,
He was
that's
so
lovely.
proud of it.
You talked about the open plan and the idea of getting people to bump into each other. Well, that was fine for workers, but the executives, it was just the opposite. So they even had their own bathrooms, right? And you pointed that out. So they never really had to leave their office. And I started out in research downtown, and I got a different job being responsible for facilities and of the research site. And I had to write 1 year a capital plan for the downtown site on the annual report. So I called out the business library, and they said, come out to Building 88, we'll set you up an office with all the annual reports and the facility plans from other divisions from last year. So I went out there and sat in an office, private office, with my own bathroom, with my own courtyard.
Wow.
And I never saw a person the entire day. So
Yeah, it's always that, the difference between the ideal and the real. Yeah.
I started with Upjohn in '79 in an entry-level position in Building 88.
Oh, wow.
And you knew how you moved up because in your pictures, if you look carefully at the ceiling, there are what they call holes. And so you started out in a 4-holer.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
As if you got promotions, you would go to a 6-holer. That allowed you to have a little table or a couch if you wanted it, and went up from there. J Court, I believe, was the only place the executives had, those offices had their own restroom facilities. And oftentimes they had 2 offices. They had an outer office where they met people and talked to people, and they had an inner office where they could work privately on whatever they were doing and not be disturbed.
Interesting.
those coffers, by the way, were the size of the ceiling tile, and they went up. Each of those was that was plaster, and they were handmade, one coffer at a time, shipped and installed in that building. It was phenomenal.
It's amazing. It's amazing. The level of detail and the materials are just extraordinary. I mean, you can't build like that anymore. It'll never be done again, really.
I worked in Building 88 as well.
well. I thought it was interesting, they had elevators at that time, and the barber shop, and they had a legal library,
And a dentist, right?
and they had courtyards situated so that everybody had space to the outside. And so that was always really beautiful. Weeping Japanese cherry tree next to me.
Oh, lovely.
And,
They did have a barber shop, but I don't think they had a dentist.
Okay,
At least not from 79 or 40.
yeah.
but they had a lot of products, so you could go to the doctor, and they had a nurse and doctor on staff all the time, and you'd go out the office and do products, whatever you needed, you never paid for drugs.
I was reading that there was a special vanilla that they would distribute. You couldn't buy it anywhere, but it was like a special vanilla extract.
It was probably for being hot.
It was an Upjohn product.
Oh,
It was an Upjohn product, vanilla.
So the Upjohn vanilla was made once a year. It was made in 41. I used to work there too. And it was made just before the Thanksgiving holidays, like late October, early November, in the classic gray and white trade dress. It was sold in the company pharmacy, where by the 80s, you could buy stuff that the company made that wasn't prescription. And it was very inexpensive, and it was 100% real vanilla. And the rumor was that it was there because one of the senior executives, who probably lived in Jayport, his wife decided she wanted good vanilla for cooking her holiday treats.
ah,
And therefore, pints of this stuff would go out the door and probably at a loss. But in those days, it was more about taking care of the employees.
that's great.
I heard, now what happened to all the materials in that building? Obviously, there were some exquisite materials and composition. Does anybody know when they demolished it?
Well, I have a colleague who took a pickup truck out and grabbed some of the marble and has it in his garden. But I'm not sure. Do other people know what happened with these materials?
Some of them were saved by what was the city manager in Portage. And they went, who was also, he was a construction manager at Western, and he was also the mayor.
Pete Strike.
Yeah, and they recycled some of the materials into, which building was it? The new Sangres, I think.
Sacred Hall. That's interesting. Huh. Very interesting. Yeah.
And I also remember the demise before they actually raised it. They were trying to, open landscape was becoming prevalent in offices, and they had an international building behind the Taj Mahal that was open landscape. And they were trying to incorporate that. It just kind of destroyed the interior of the building. Now they put partitions up in the open aisleways, and they, they shut down the barber shop, and things got claustrophobic in there. They couldn't heat it appropriately that way, because now you got people in the aisles, and not really in designated office areas and courtyard areas. So,
Interesting. So it went
that
through.
was sad to see them try to use a piano or something different than it was designed.
Yeah. I knew I was excited to talk about this because I was like, there's going to be some really good stories that I can gather. So I really do urge you, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. And I'm going to try to record some of these comments too for the future. Oh, one more.
Could you put your contact information?
Yes. Also, if you don't get this contact information somehow or need it again, I teach at Kalamazoo College. So if you just Google Christine at Kalamazoo College, it should come up. Yeah.
I worked in 88 right before they closed it, and there were different groups in there that there had been previously. Legal was still in there, legal and from So this was my pharmacy. It had been taken over by Pfizer. So, so there was, the head of quality control was in an office there. The, like I said, the remnants of legal. You know, there were these disparate groups who were all stuck in the building together because there wasn't room for them in 41, or 298 had been closed already and they needed to move somewhere. But I remember the president of my group had one of the offices on J Court, and so he had a bathroom, but supposedly he also had a cot back there. And his secretary, when she couldn't get childcare, would bring her kids.
Oh, wow.
And they would nap in his back office.
Oh,
And,
neat.
you know, so she, when my kids were born, she told me that, oh yeah, I used to bring my kids. They would nap, and then I was like, whoa, I didn't think I would have the balls to do that.
All those tucked away little spaces.
Yeah, and the people in Building 88 obviously got a lot more leeway. If I had still been in 41, there's no way I would have, you know, I ever would have heard a story like that where somebody brought their kids in.
Oh, interesting. Is that because it was just kind of sort of set apart and a little more remote?
It was where, you know, once you were in 88, nobody was keeping an eye on you.
Interesting.
You know, you could do kind of what you wanted.
Well, so you bring up an interesting point, which is my argument is sort of set against this other scholar who looks at the high-rise building infrastructure from the 1950s. And his argument is really that Soames' building structure really helped keep surveillance on workers because of the networks that because you were in this sort of like siloed environment. And that Building 88, in contrast, it's not really a surveillance easy spot because everything is so diffuse and spread out. So that's another element that I didn't talk about today, but.
Also, the buildings, the reason it was called Building 88, it was the 88th building built.
Yes.
The 41 was.
The 40, yeah, exactly. Their naming structure makes it really easy. Although you wouldn't necessarily know that 88 is like the special building because it's just Building 88. Yeah. I think I was supposed to finish up. And so thank you so much. I would really love to hear from you if you do have additional comments and things. So please do send me an email at christine.hahn@kzu.edu. Thank you so much.